The B-29 pilot who saw SAS tactics from above and watched Viet Cong fighters tremble. The B-29's engines droned through humid Vietnamese air, while heat thermals from the jungle canopy below sent tremors through the aluminum fuselage that made every instrument dial flutter like nervous eyes. Through the bombardier's position, I could see them, shadows moving wrong through undergrowth that should have been impenetrable, forms that blended so perfectly with the green hell beneath us that my mind struggled to separate human from vegetation. 20,000 feet below, something was happening that violated every assumption I'd ever held about jungle warfare, about the limitations of human movement through terrain that could swallow entire battalions without a trace. The Viet Cong fighters scattered like startled animals, their AK-47s abandoned in their desperate flight from predators they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't fight. Through my binoculars, I watched grown men, hardened guerrillas who had faced B-52 carpet bombing and napalm strikes without breaking, running through the undergrowth with the panicked movements of prey animals who had suddenly realized they were being hunted by something that operated beyond their understanding of warfare. British SAS operators moved through that green maze with precision that seemed to transcend human limitations, appearing from nowhere to strike with surgical accuracy before vanishing again into vegetation that seemed to welcome them like living allies. The radio crackled, with Vietnamese voices edged in terror, as unit commanders tried to coordinate responses to threats they couldn't locate or identify, their transmissions breaking apart in bursts of static that carried screams I couldn't understand, but recognized as the universal language of absolute fear. From my position in the cockpit of a machine designed to deliver industrial-scale destruction, I found myself witnessing warfare that had been refined to an art form so terrible and beautiful that it challenged everything I believed about the relationship between technology and human skill. What I witnessed below would change everything I believed about war. If you're hearing this, stay until the end. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. These memories need witnesses. To understand why that night broke something inside me, we need to go back to a farm in Nebraska, where a 16-year-old boy first heard the sound of aircraft engines cutting through prairie silence, and looked up to see a formation of B-17 flying fortresses banking over cornfields that stretched beyond the horizon in waves of green and gold. That boy was me, and from that moment forward, everything else in my life became preparation for the day I would command one of those machines that ruled the sky above a world torn apart by conflicts too large for individual comprehension. My father raised wheat and cattle with the methodical patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be hurried, but my dreams moved at the speed of those aircraft I watched, crossing our vast skies with increasing frequency, as America prepared for wars that would test everything we believed about ourselves and our enemies. The local airfield was nothing more than a grass strip and a corrugated metal hangar where crop dusters and male pilots would occasionally stop for fuel. But to my young eyes, it might as well have been the gateway to a larger world where men could transcend the limitations that confined them to two-dimensional existence. When the Army Air Forces announced its recruitment drive for aircrew in 1943, I enlisted before the ink was dry on my high school diploma, motivated by patriotic duty, but driven even more by the certainty that my future lay somewhere above the ground, serving in machines that could strike targets hundreds of miles from their bases and return home the same day. Flight training revealed both the mechanical complexity and psychological demands of military aviation. Learning to fly the B-29 Superfortress required mastering systems so sophisticated that understanding them completely demanded months of study that went far beyond basic piloting skills. The aircraft was a flying technological marvel. Pressurized cabin, remote-controlled defensive turrets, navigation equipment that could find targets anywhere in the world, bomb bay capacity that could carry destruction sufficient to level entire city blocks. But more challenging was developing the mental discipline necessary to function effectively in combat situations where split-second decisions could determine not just crew survival, but the success or failure of operations involving dozens of aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. The B-29 became more than just an aircraft. She was a technological cathedral that represented America's industrial capacity, transformed into flying weapons platform capable of delivering strategic destruction with precision that previous generations of warriors could never have imagined possible. Everything about her suggested power held in careful balance. The four Wright R-3350 engines that could carry 30 tons of aircraft and ordnance to altitudes where human life required artificial support. The defensive armament that could engage enemy fighters from any angle. The bomb bay that could accommodate ordnance loads sufficient to destroy industrial facilities or military installations with single missions. But it was the psychological isolation that proved most challenging to master. Flying combat missions in a B-29 meant operating at altitudes where the Earth became an abstract pattern of colors and shapes, where human features disappeared entirely and targets became coordinates on maps rather than places where people lived and worked. The aircraft created a technological barrier between aircrew and ground reality that made warfare feel like an elaborate simulation. A psychological distance that allowed normal human beings to participate in destruction that would have been impossible to inflict through direct, personal violence. Deployment to Southeast Asia brought us face to face with the reality that no amount of training could have adequately prepared us for. Vietnam was a war that operated according to different rules than the conflicts our aircraft had been designed to fight, involving enemies who possessed skills and tactics that seemed to violate conventional military logic. The landscape itself was an adversary. Jungles so dense that downed aircrew were often never recovered, weather patterns that could ground entire air fleets for weeks, terrain that offered unlimited concealment to forces that understood how to use geography as a tactical advantage. Our base at Utapao in Thailand was a collection of concrete runways and prefabricated buildings, surrounded by monsoon-soaked landscape that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. A technological island in an environment that seemed designed to swallow mechanical civilization and return it to the organic chaos from which it had emerged. The heat was oppressive, humidity that made breathing an effort and turned flight suits into personal saunas, while the smell of rotting vegetation mixed with jet fuel and human waste created an atmospheric signature that meant Southeast Asia to everyone who served there. But it was the nature of the enemy that proved most psychologically challenging. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces operated according to principles that emphasized patience, stealth, and psychological warfare over direct confrontation with superior American firepower. They would appear without warning to inflict casualties and then disappear again into terrain that offered perfect concealment, creating a form of warfare that felt more like hunting than traditional military operations. American forces possessed overwhelming advantages in equipment, mobility, and fire support. But these advantages became liabilities when confronting enemies who refused to engage in the kind of conventional battles where technological superiority could be decisive. It was during briefings about ground operations that I first heard rumors about units that weren't American, weren't Vietnamese, and weren't supposed to exist according to any official documentation. Other air crews spoke in whispers about special forces teams that operated without radio coordination, about contacts that appeared and disappeared with suspicious precision, about enemy units that would engage American forces aggressively but would abandon prepared positions rather than risk encounter with certain other operators. The stories were always second-hand, passed along by crew chiefs and intelligence officers who claimed to have overheard conversations or seen equipment that didn't match standard issue specifications. British weapons, they said. European camouflage patterns, accents on radio frequencies that weren't monitored by normal intelligence channels. Combat techniques that seemed to transcend anything taught in conventional military schools, applied by men who moved through jungle terrain with skills that bordered on the supernatural. The Viet Cong, according to these same rumors, had begun exhibiting behavior that troubled even seasoned intelligence analysts. Captured documents spoke of invisible enemies and jungle demons who could kill without sound and disappear without leaving tracks. I dismissed most of these stories as the kind of folklore that grows around any conflict where normal rules don't apply. Every war produces its share of ghost stories and monster tales, psychological defense mechanisms that help military personnel cope with stresses too large to confront directly. But as the months passed and the rumors became more specific and more consistent, I began to suspect that something real was operating in those green depths, something that our official briefings were careful never to acknowledge. The mission that shattered my skepticism began like any other. Pre-dawn briefing in a windowless room that smelled of coffee and mildew, weather reports that promised marginal flying conditions, target coordinates that placed us over jungle so remote that successful completion would require navigation skills that pushed our equipment to its limits. The objective was close air support for a ground operation in Tay Ninh province, near the Cambodian border, where enemy infiltration routes carried supplies and personnel into South Vietnam through terrain that defied conventional interdiction efforts. But there were anomalies that became apparent only in retrospect. The briefing officer, normally comfortable with the casual efficiency that characterized most air support missions, seemed unusually nervous about details he couldn't specify. Radio frequencies were different from our usual channels, using authentication codes that changed according to schedules none of us had been given. Most significantly, we were instructed to maintain radio silence, except for genuine emergencies, and to avoid photographing or documenting anything we observed on the ground. The flight to the target area took us over landscape that seemed designed to conceal whatever was happening beneath the triple canopy jungle that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. Occasional clearings were mostly bomb craters from previous missions, perfect circles of devastation that nature was already beginning to reclaim. Rivers snaked through the green like brown scars, while scattered villages appeared and disappeared beneath our wings, like mirages that might never have existed at all. As we approached the coordinates, I could see smoke rising through the canopy in thin columns that suggested small arms fire rather than heavy ordnance. Ground control vectored us into a holding pattern at 20,000 feet, high enough to avoid anti-aircraft fire, but low enough to observe ground operations if the jungle broke enough to permit visibility. The B-29 flew herself at that altitude, autopilot maintaining course and speed, while the crew monitored instruments and scanned the sky for threats that seemed unlikely, but remained theoretically possible. That's when I saw something that challenged every assumption I had developed about jungle warfare during months of flying support missions over Southeast Asia. Through gaps in the vegetation, movement that wasn't random or chaotic like typical guerrilla fighting, but coordinated with precision that suggested training far superior to anything I had observed from either American or Vietnamese forces. Small groups of figures, impossible to identify as friendly or hostile from altitude, were moving through undergrowth in patterns that seemed to violate physical laws governing human movement through such terrain. But it was the reaction of clearly identifiable Viet Cong forces that transformed routine observation into something that would haunt me for decades. These were fighters who had demonstrated courage and tactical competence in previous encounters with American ground forces, men who would attack superior numbers rather than retreat from prepared positions. But they were running now with the desperate energy of animals, fleeing a forest fire, abandoning weapons and equipment in their haste to escape something that remained invisible to my eyes. I descended to get a better view, pushing the B-29 down to 15,000 feet, where the humid air carried scents of vegetation and cooking fires, where the jungle canopy passed beneath our wings in detail that revealed individual trees and clearings too small to appear on navigation charts. The four right engines maintained their steady rhythm, but I found myself unconsciously holding my breath as I watched a form of warfare that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. That's when I finally saw them clearly. British SAS operators, moving through that jungle hell with skills that seemed to approach the supernatural. They appeared and disappeared like smoke, materializing from vegetation that looked too thin to conceal a rabbit, much less grown men carrying full combat equipment. Their camouflage wasn't just the random patterns of standard military uniforms, it was carefully constructed deception that incorporated living vegetation and natural materials to create optical illusions that fooled the eye even when you knew where to look. But it wasn't just their concealment that made them terrifying to observe from altitude. It was their movement. Patient, predatory, utterly coordinated, like pack animals hunting prey that had no chance of escape. They communicated without visible signals, appeared in positions that should have required more time to reach than the tactical situation allowed, struck with precision that eliminated threats before effective resistance could be organized. From the B-29's cockpit, I watched Viet Cong fighters freeze mid-step when they sensed rather than saw the presence of hunters they couldn't locate. The fear in their body language was so pure, so primitive, that it transcended political boundaries and military objectives. These weren't soldiers responding to superior firepower or tactical disadvantage. They were prey animals, suddenly realizing they were being hunted by predators that operated according to rules they didn't understand. If this part of the story resonates with you, leave a comment. It keeps these memories alive. The engagement, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Brief bursts of automatic weapons fire echoed through the jungle, muzzle flashes appearing and disappearing like deadly fireflies in the green twilight beneath the canopy. But unlike typical firefights, which involved sustained exchanges between identifiable positions, this was more like an execution carried out with surgical precision. The SAS operators struck where and when they chose, eliminating specific targets before melting back into vegetation that seemed to welcome them like living conspirators. Radio intercepts from Vietnamese frequencies revealed the psychological impact of what was happening on the ground. Unit commanders tried desperately to coordinate responses to threats they couldn't identify or engage effectively, their transmissions fragmenting into bursts of static, punctuated by voices that carried unmistakable notes of panic. Individual soldiers reported contact and then went silent, while others described movement that seemed to violate basic assumptions about human capabilities in jungle terrain. But what disturbed me most was watching the systematic destruction of unit cohesion among forces that had demonstrated remarkable resilience under conventional military pressure. Viet Cong fighters who had withstood B-52 strikes and artillery bombardments were abandoning prepared positions and scattering through undergrowth with the random patterns of complete tactical breakdown. Whatever was happening below represented psychological warfare refined to a level that transcended mere military technique. The SAS operators moved through that chaos with mechanical precision that suggested months or years of preparation for exactly this kind of operation. They weren't just eliminating enemy personnel, they were systematically destroying the psychological foundations that made organized resistance possible. Each carefully planned action created maximum disruption while leaving minimal evidence that could be used to identify the attackers or understand their methods. From my position, 20,000 feet above the action, suspended between earth and sky in a machine designed to deliver industrial-scale destruction, I found myself witnessing warfare that had been refined to an art form so efficient it seemed almost supernatural. The contrast between American tactical doctrine, which emphasized overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, and what I was observing below, was so complete that it challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern conflicts should be fought. When the action ended, the silence was profound. No wounded crying for help, no radio chatter, no sounds of movement through undergrowth. The jungle had swallowed the violence and returned to its normal rhythms as if nothing had happened. From altitude, there was no visible evidence of combat, no bodies, no equipment, no disturbance of vegetation that would indicate human presence. If I hadn't witnessed it directly, I would never have believed that anything had occurred. But the Viet Cong forces that had scattered during the engagement didn't return to their original positions. Radio intercepts suggested that entire units had simply vanished, either eliminated or so demoralized that they were no longer capable of organized military action. The psychological impact rippled through enemy communications for hours afterward, creating confusion and uncertainty that affected operations across a much larger area than the immediate tactical engagement. The flight back to base passed in contemplative silence that seemed to affect the entire crew. What we had witnessed wasn't conventional warfare as any of us understood it, but something that transcended normal military categories. The SAS operators had achieved their objectives without collateral damage, without excessive use of force, and without leaving evidence that could be used against them politically or militarily. They had simply appeared, eliminated their targets, and vanished again, leaving behind only fear and confusion among their enemies. But what haunted me was the efficiency with which it had been accomplished. There was something inhuman about their precision, something that transcended normal military training and entered realms that seemed to violate natural laws governing human capabilities. They weren't soldiers in any sense I understood. They were something else entirely. Predators who had evolved beyond conventional limitations through training and experience that remained incomprehensible to outside observers. The debriefing was unlike any I had previously experienced. Instead of the usual detailed questions about enemy positions and weapon effects, intelligence officers seemed focused on ensuring that we understood the classified nature of what we had observed. They used phrases like operational security and compartmentalized information, while carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of British forces or special operations. The message was clear. What we had seen was real, but it was also a state secret that could have serious consequences if discussed inappropriately. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of surprise at our account. These men had known what we were going to observe before we ever took off, had positioned us to witness something that couldn't be officially acknowledged through normal intelligence channels. We weren't combat aircrew who had stumbled onto a classified operation. We were carefully selected observers, documenting capabilities that existed beyond the reach of conventional military oversight. In the weeks that followed, I found myself avoiding conversations about the mission, even with crew members who had shared the experience. The subject felt too dangerous to discuss casually, too heavy with implications that none of us fully understood. I began to realize that certain kinds of knowledge created isolation as effectively as physical barriers, separating those who had witnessed things beyond normal experience from others who operated within conventional frameworks of understanding. The war continued around us with its familiar rhythm of briefings and missions and casualties that were reported through channels designed to maintain public support for operations, whose real nature remained classified at levels none of us could access. But I found myself watching the jungle differently during subsequent missions, wondering what else was happening beneath that green canopy that never appeared in official reports or intelligence summaries. How many operations were conducted by forces that didn't officially exist? How many victories were achieved by men whose presence was denied by their own governments? The fog of war, I learned, wasn't just about confusion during combat. It was about deliberately obscuring truths that were too sensitive for public consumption or democratic oversight. When my tour ended 18 months later, I returned to Nebraska carrying knowledge that felt heavier than any physical burden. The country I came back to was beginning to question its involvement in Southeast Asia, but the debates I heard in newspapers and on television seemed to miss essential points about the nature of modern warfare. We weren't just fighting Vietnamese communists with conventional American forces. We were part of a global conflict that involved capabilities and techniques that remained hidden from the democratic processes that were supposed to govern military policy. For years, I told myself that what I had witnessed was an aberration, a single operation that didn't represent broader patterns in how democratic nations conducted classified military operations. The SAS team had been temporary advisors whose presence in Vietnam was a brief experiment that ended with the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia. But as declassified documents began appearing decades later, I learned that such operations had been far more extensive than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The photographs and after-action reports made for uncomfortable reading. The men I had watched operate with such terrifying efficiency had been part of a much larger program designed to demonstrate capabilities that conventional forces couldn't match. Their presence had been a message to enemies and allies about the sophistication of Western special operations capabilities, delivered through missions that could be denied if political circumstances required such denial. What haunted me most was the memory of those Viet Cong fighters scattering through the jungle with terror so pure it transcended military categories and touched something primitive in human psychology. They had encountered something that exceeded their understanding of warfare, and that encounter had broken fundamental assumptions about their ability to fight effectively against enemies they couldn't see or comprehend. The nightmares started years after the war ended. Quiet dreams where I circled endlessly above green canopy while shadows moved beneath with predatory purpose that seemed to violate natural law. In these dreams, I could see individual faces among the fleeing Vietnamese fighters, men looking up at my aircraft with expressions that mixed confusion and terror, and something that might have been pleading for explanation of what was happening to them. I never found answers to those unspoken questions, partly because the answers remained classified, and partly because they involved moral territories that I wasn't equipped to navigate alone. The SAS operators had been doing jobs they had trained for extensively, applying skills that represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution. The Vietnamese fighters had been doing their jobs as well, defending territory they considered their homeland against foreign forces they saw as invaders. Both sides had been playing roles in a larger drama that neither fully understood or controlled. But the psychological costs of that drama were borne by individuals who had never been asked whether they wanted to participate in warfare that transcended normal human limitations. The efficiency I had witnessed from altitude represented achievements in military science that raised questions about the prices civilized societies should ask their warriors to pay for tactical superiority. Time has a way of putting such experiences into perspective, but some memories resist the healing effects of years passing. I can discuss the technical aspects of that mission now: aircraft performance at tropical altitudes, radio procedures for classified operations, the psychological effects of extended combat tours. But I can't escape the emotional weight of watching human beings discover that their enemies possessed capabilities that seemed to approach the supernatural. The British operators I observed that day were professionals, applying expertise developed through years of training in similar environments. They weren't monsters or sociopaths, but highly skilled soldiers using superior tactics to achieve legitimate military objectives with minimal collateral damage. Yet the psychological impact of their operations went far beyond immediate tactical results, creating fear that influenced enemy behavior long after they had departed for other assignments. Sometimes, when I'm flying civilian aircraft over forests that remind me of Vietnamese jungle, I find myself scanning tree lines with habits that refuse to fade completely. Part of me still expects to see movement that doesn't belong, shadows that shift with unnatural purpose, signs of predators that remain invisible until they choose to strike. The skills that made those SAS operators so effective haven't disappeared. They've been refined and passed to new generations of warriors who face different enemies in different environments, but apply the same fundamental principles of stealth, precision, and psychological dominance. The fear that drove Vietnamese fighters to abandon positions and equipment wasn't irrational or cowardly. It was an appropriate response to encountering enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything in their experience or training. Modern insurgents face similar challenges when confronting special operations forces that have evolved the techniques I witnessed into forms of military art that approach perfection in their deadly efficiency. Yet I can't help wondering about the long-term costs of developing such capabilities, both for the men who possess them and the societies that deploy them. Soldiers who operate at that level of efficiency in eliminating human threats carry psychological burdens that civilian populations can't adequately understand or support. The price of creating such warriors may exceed the tactical advantages they provide, measured in casualties that don't appear in official statistics, but manifest years later in suicide rates and family dysfunction that persist long after conflicts end. The B-29 that carried me over that Vietnamese jungle represented American industrial capacity transformed into strategic weapons platform, capable of delivering destruction on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. But what I witnessed from her cockpit that day suggested that the future of warfare lay not in massive technological systems, but in small groups of highly trained individuals who could achieve tactical objectives with precision that made conventional military operations seem primitive by comparison. The sky had become a platform for observation of evolutionary changes in human conflict that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technology and military effectiveness. Large aircraft like the B-29 could deliver destruction across vast distances, but they couldn't match the psychological impact achieved by a handful of operators who understood how to use terrain, timing, and human psychology as weapons more devastating than any conventional ordnance. If you want more testimonies from the sky, stories too heavy for history books, subscribe. These memories deserve witnesses. What I saw that day in Vietnamese airspace wasn't just tactical success. It was evidence that warfare itself was evolving beyond the reach of democratic oversight or moral frameworks developed for conflicts between conventional military forces. The men who possessed such capabilities were becoming something new, warriors whose skills transcended normal human limitations, but whose actions remained hidden from the societies they served. Some operations end when objectives are achieved, but others continue indefinitely in the memories of those who witnessed capabilities that challenged everything they believed about human nature and the limits of what civilized nations should ask their defenders to become. The trembling I observed among enemy fighters wasn't just fear of death. It was recognition that they faced something that operated beyond their understanding of warfare, something that made their courage and determination irrelevant, regardless of the righteousness of their cause.